can I steal a moment of your time before this episode plays? Thanks so much for listening to Labours of Sports Coaching. The appetite I see for the blend of academic and practical coaching conversations happening on the show is nothing short of amazing, and I'm determined to make this show bigger and better. Now, to help with that mission, please can I ask that you follow and rate the show 5 stars wherever you're listening. This takes maybe 10 seconds and has a massive effect on increasing the show's visibility, and as a result of that, its potential for future growth, which ultimately will enhance your return as a committed listener. Also check out the show support links for anyone looking to offer that extra bit of backing. There's much more to come for Labours of Sports Coaching, and I thank you for joining and driving our new community. And with that, enjoy this episode. Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of Labours of Sports Coaching. I thought I might kick off a bit of a solo episode here with a topic that I've been ruminating on for a little while. I've actually already had a bit of a wee article that I wrote on this too, but just for the purposes of those who perhaps might not have seen that, or indeed may not be inclined to read about one passage, I thought, why don't we chat about it on here? So this is a topic that's about theming our sessions. Okay, that word theme, we see it's synonymous with any sort of coach planning. You do a needs assessment on your athlete. You decide that he or she or they need to work at a specific part of their overall performance. Irrespective of whether or not you see skill acquisition being an accumulation of looking at a performance and its constituent parts, it may actually be that you see performances, just breaking up the game per se from the parent game into its constituent parts, or actually modularising the technical performance of a skill. We can be speaking across both here, I think. But we do have a natural sway towards deliberately practicing parts of a player's performance that we feel is helpful for them, but that offers a certain element of specificity to the training that ensures across, and I think that is particularly important across, a longer duration of practice, that there's no leakages, because I think what's quite often easy to do in coaching is to be quite reactive, and perhaps, particularly if you are coaching within a format where there's competition and where there's some sort of assessment on your player, that we can use the outcomes of that assessment even in a formative setting, maybe with youth players, or indeed it could be senior players as well. But sometimes we do go, right, we struggled with this as part of the game, so now I'm going to practice this part of the game next week, and sometimes that's not great, because again you're going to miss out on other parts of a player's development. If I was to contextualise it to football, I can't always, because we've got a poor defence, keep working on defence every week. Sometimes I need to work on the attacking side of the game to ensure that there's a balance to that within that wider curriculum for our players' development, and that's what themes helps you do. It helps in one way ensure that you can work through different parts of a player's skill, or skill set rather. It also helps us actually feel confident about our own training sessions, and the reason I bring this up is I think as coaches we do find sometimes it's for us and not always our players, at least not directly for our players. Themes are allowed session planning to be more accessible, because it does offer in some way a structure, something to aim for, goalposts that are quite clear and tangible. If I said to myself, certainly, 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago, put a session together that's based on dribbling and shooting versus put a session together that's going to help my athletes get better at the sport, I would be able to bet my house that, that younger version of myself would have said, I would much rather do the theme session because it gives me something to work at, something to aim for. So that's all good, and I just say this as a starting point because this isn't a ramble against theming sessions, but I just think in order to have any sort of balanced discussion, it's important to firstly talk about what the strengths can be for having themes within a session, and again, as I say, offering a sort of deliberateness to our practice, a focus, a specificity to it. Not just episodically, session by session at the micro level, but in the macro level, in the macro scale, then indeed there being able to then ensure that we're actually, building towards something and building towards something that's not got leakages, and again, as I say, also giving ourselves confidence when we're planning that. All that stuff's great, and that's why we see theme sessions at the core of most skill development programs. Okay, it gives us confidence. And that's just something that they're really useful and they're tried and tested. Okay, but do we actually use them correctly? Right? When we theme a session, there's a tendency that we begin the session by getting the team together, or your athlete, even if it's an individual sport, tennis, whatever, and we'll say, right, we're going to work on this today. This is the theme of the session. Okay, and in fact, these are the intended learning outcomes of our session. So we're going to work on counter-attacking, and the intended learning outcomes this week are about being fast off the mark, fast to get the ball moving forward, fast to secure the ball, just whatever it is within that. And we're quite explicit sometimes in telling our athletes that. We see that as a good thing, and it is in a lot of ways. It's almost like being collaborative with them and creating a dialogue that we think helps with attention, and indeed it will. We then sort of move through the session, fairly fixated on the theme. We have exercises that are absolutely about compartmentalising the performance towards training just the parts of the performance that we care about. If it's not the technical skill in its very isolated form, then indeed it's that situated cognition or the decision making and how we use the skill in a more tactical sense, okay, within the session. And we'll have stoppages and we'll talk and we reiterate the theme of the session, and then we actually, we'll get back to the end of the session, we do the debrief with the players, and we'll go, okay, what were we working on today? That is quite typical of a lot of coaching sessions. Okay, and again, it's great. It encourages focus. It helps us set mini goals for the players, not just at a team level, but maybe even as an individual. Okay, and we can start to, in our one-to-one coaching, if it's in a team sport, we can then speak to, Stephen or Lucy and the guys and say, look, within this, can you apply this target within the theme, so that there's still exploration within the theme, but the theme is a sort of umbrella that helps sort of bracket the learning. Okay, and that can be really good. However, I'm going to, just to be devil's advocate here, I would argue that while that's good, we also inadvertently risk constraining actually how many learning outcomes could be achieved by putting boundaries on what can be discussed, what can be corrected, and indeed what even can be encouraged, not just during the session, but even after the session, because again, we always want to leave our players with reflective thoughts to then carry forward, in the car ride home or, after the training session. And that's because we need to recognise that skill acquisition, okay, it's not, we try to control it. I think as coaches, that's something we want in some sense for our own sanity. We feel we want to control things, and there's the reality that when we execute a skill, we don't execute any one skill in a vacuum, certainly not within the dynamic realms of sport. Okay, even if we move from a sort of traditional drill-based exercise, all right, we may be able to really constrain it there, but indeed you're going to then put them into a session or even a game or a competition afterwards where things are happening all at once, okay? So things will not really happen in a vacuum, even if we try to engineer it in that way, okay? And if you think about it, most of the skills and knowledge that you need in your sport is going to come out in any sort of game-based practice that you do. So regardless of what the theme is that you attach to it, right? So, just go and do your passing themed session tonight. See, as soon as that ball moves, tell me how many other themes come out. Regardless if you've constrained the environment and you've made it in such a way that you think is coaxing out that theme, and it very well may do. But there's going to be attacking in there. There's going to be defending in there. There's going to be counter attacking in there. I'm contextualising this to football, but again, transfer it to your own sport. There's no hiding from other themes in your theme session. The game does not care about your theme. Okay, when the game plays, the game practices every theme imaginable. Okay, and therefore, from a sort of pedagogical perspective, there are so many more opportunities to talk to players about the things that they've just experienced than just your theme alone. Okay, now we know that we need to speak, or we need to, but it's suggested that we should do it at different times. Talk to your players about their experiences to help them sort of construct, knowledge, disrupt their own schema, reconstruct that knowledge, improve upon it, and consolidate it. Okay, that we need them to be musing the information that's in their working memory, and having that dialogue is really important. So with all these helpful conversations we want to have, if we narrow the conversations to only one part of what they're experiencing, then what happens to the other 80% of what they experienced? I know that there's implicitly learned knowledge that just comes in the assimilated experiences, but as coaches, when we know that we can take advantage of that further by, actually bringing these experiences to the forefront of conversations at different times, and to do all those sorts of things, that we're perhaps neglecting that, and maybe we're not really maybe that's suboptimal, because then they aren't actually able to get everything out of the session that you would like them to. Because think about it, okay, we all experience learning outcomes differently. So I do a training session with a group of players. One player, just not always just by coincidence, but to some extent sometimes can be by coincidence. One player, it gets loads of dribbling opportunities within that session that was themed around dribbling. But other players who just didn't have the ball that often, they got far more learning outcomes around defending. They didn't have as many learning outcomes around dribbling. Okay, now that player's been left in the shadow. Meanwhile, we've been really acting on the dribbling part, and therefore only some of the team are actually getting as full a benefit of that training session as compared to others. So is that really fair? Now, I know that there's then the counter argument that would say, well, we don't want to overload our players, that sort of cognitive load theory. We don't want to overload our players by talking about too many things at once. If we do, there's always a likelihood that perhaps they then aren't able to make sense of anything at all. Therefore, it's the idea, we need to bracket the conversation, chunk out information so we don't overload them and let their working memory just focus on one thing at a time. Okay? But I would counter that again by just recognising the reality that is players' attention really guaranteed in moments that perhaps they can attach less personal meaning to. So that player who hasn't really been dribbling in that session, it's themed around dribbling, they've not had the ball as much, or perhaps they've been put in situations they've had to pass the ball more. Okay, that player, is they really going to be as interested in listening to you discuss moments that they weren't really a part of? Okay, moments that other people were a part of and had richer, memory of, that they could lean back on and use as a frame of reference because it happened and it was there and it was aligned to what you were talking about. If it wasn't aligned to them, are we really guaranteeing that they players listen anyway? So what I'm meaning by that is that, well, yes, we can have a theme. We can't be really tightly wound up about only discussing that theme. Okay, sometimes you might have a theme, but for the wider group, but things will happen, and that's not even just for the wider group, but things will happen that you sometimes do need to deviate away from the theme and distrust counter-attack, even if the session was about counter-press, or even if the session was a defensive target, you still need to distrust an attacking target. Why would you not make the most of a teachable moment? Why would you hold that moment back? Why would, and there's a bit of an argument to be said there, that because we know that players won't all attach the same amount of meaning to moments universally. So we can't hedge our bets on universal concentration by players on those messages around one element of the game at a time. The whole game happens at once, okay, in a dynamic training environment, the whole game will happen at once. So we have to be willing to tailor the conversation, okay, and we can't miss out on opportunities to do that by being too caught up in focusing on the theme non-stop from the start of the session to the end, okay. I think personally there's also a risk that, because as I say, we're quite explicit to players about what we're working on often, that we formalise the learning too much. I think this has got a lot of, maybe more for senior players, this isn't as big an issue, but certainly for young players, where we want them to lean into the intrinsic love and interest in the sport. As soon as you formalise learning, you do risk diluting what could be seen as a precious resource in their sort of motivational armoury, and that, they want to have fun, they want to be playing games that night. What the kids always say to you, what we playing next, when are we playing a game? And it's hard enough to get them to think about everything they're doing as a game, as a form of the parent game, if we're doing a sort of game-based approach. But if we constantly then further dilute the interest they have in whatever they're doing by saying, we're doing this and it's about passing, they want to play football, they don't want to play passing. They want to, let's think about and keep in their heads this idea of the wider holistic whole. Okay, and this isn't without, I don't say this without precedent, so there's credibility to this position if you notice that there's actually a game-based approach known as gamification in coaching. Now, that's had a lot of success within education. It's now actually found its way into coaching, and that's actually asking coaches to replace naming exercises in a themed way with given missions. Okay, so the mission is, and they'll call it something that's totally masks to some extent what the skill is that we're working on, whether it's about stealing balls out the baskets or breaking players out of jail. That can be as creative as you want it to be. So that could be a passing exercise, where we're trying to move the ball to a player in the end zone and then back out again. It's disguised. The formal aspect of that passing that we're working on is disguised with the mission of breaking them out of jail. That sort of thing. And again, the reason I just go back to that is then it's so that we're avoiding stifling their enjoyment, their interest, and their imagination, what lies ahead. So in terms of the connection to that, I just go back to the idea that, again, there's the risk with theming your session, not just in what you're doing when you pick at certain moments and what moments you decide to focus attention on. If you do intervene at different points, there's also risks in terms of just the formalisation of learning that accompanies that general tone to a session. Okay, so why am I saying this now? What is the solution to this? It's not that you just lose all themes in a session. Okay, there's different ways in a spectrum that we could pay attention to this, because again, I wouldn't be recommending that we go away from theme session. They offer specificity that's really important. But perhaps if you do have a core theme to your session and you're trying to put that session into practice, maybe hide what the core theme is from your players. That could just be one small sort of presentation tweak that I think is quite capable of eliciting good returns, not just in their interest in what they're doing, but again, their attention paid towards teachable moments within the game. Because, as I say, also we need to couple that with be willing to digress from your core theme topic and nail those meaningful topics as they appear for the individuals in your practice or the group Okay, just to ensure that you maximise what they can take from your training session and what they can retain in their knowledge, in their memory rather. So, you have a training session that's themed, but move away from that theme as and when required. Don't be held to it. Don't miss out on that opportunity. Okay, and this is, I think, where we need to always be careful. Okay, it's not even careful, but this is where we have to exercise professional judgment and decision making with the sort of recipe for coaching that we're often taught in formal coach education settings. Again, formal coach education settings are brilliant for giving structure. We need structure, particularly when you're first starting out in coaching. I think you want structure, and that's, I think, where, having a recipe of, you do a drill and then you might do a game-based practice or those sorts of things, or, you can make the session about passing and shooting, or you can make the session about an overhead clear, let's say it's badminton or whatever. That's fine, okay, but it's just sort of figuring out a way about how you can personalise that, okay, for your coaching process, and how we can retain it if you want to retain it, but tweak it in a way that, again, elicits more returns, okay. But now that's me giving you a bit of a on the fence, okay, a way that, or not even on the fence, but if we were thinking about a spectrum of not having any themes in your session to a spectrum of having nothing but themes, in your session, and that sort of focus, that would be sitting somewhere in the middle. Okay. Similarly, you might have an overall training session that maybe you program that out of the 4 exercises you do, 2 are themed and 2 aren't. Okay, so you could try and play about with each end of the spectrum and move between them. You might do that as well. So how would you go between? How would you actually go to the no themed ones, and why? Well, what we can do for this is that we, rather than focusing on the theme, focus on principles of coaching. Okay, think about this in a way. I say this term. We think often about principles of the game. Okay, within mass sport and football, principles of the game is, what do you do with the ball? What do you do without the ball? What do you do when you've just won the ball? What do you do when you just lose the ball? There's moments in the game, and or indeed there's, what do you do in terms of using the ball to exploit space? And it's not, they're transferable. They're not very specific to any one situation. Okay, and I suppose the contrast to that might be thinking about direct tactics and systems of play. Okay, they're not as flexible and not always as conducive for transferable learning as what perhaps teaching principles of play would be. But I would actually say that we can use that same general rule within our coaching. So a themed session is quite systematic. It's quite like the tactics. It's quite like the systems of play that we would sometimes see players try and enact, or coaches try and teach them. But why not think about principles of coaching? What makes a really effective coaching session at the macro level? For me, it's things like, is there tempo in the session? It's things like, is the contact time high? Okay, so they're getting lots of repetition. Is there variability? So we're getting repetition without repetition. Is there problem solving, where there's a decision making component? Is it fun, for the intrinsic motivation? Can it be progressed or regressed as needed? Is it representative of the parent game or indeed competition conditions? And are there opportunities for players to, self-regulate? Because again, a lot of this conversations is about how we can intervene, or when we might intervene within a theme session or whatever. But again, there's times when you just need to shut up and coach silently. Okay, but again, that's a principle of coaching, and I think sometimes if we step back and stop focusing on the micro, if we step back and notice that our session is really ticking all the boxes for good principles of coaching, then that can be enough, and that might be what you just focus your planning around. So don't focus it around any one still. Focus on creating the most dynamic, the most representative, the most fun session you can do, okay? Yeah, ideally within every exercise you do, or at least spread across the exercises, different types of these traits in different orders or amounts. And what if you're able to see that? You go, yes, that is enough. That is achieving what I want to achieve. And then within that, just coach the parts of the game that come out. Okay, they're all parts of the game that come out, but coach the parts, the meaningful moments whenever you see them. And don't be bogged down by, any theme. Don't take the theme out of your head. Keep the game in your head. Okay, now, that's another way that if you just want to abandon it altogether, again, not meaning in a absolute radical way where you never do a theme session again in your life. I don't think that's useful. I really would disagree on that. But every now and again, in terms of you get the synergy between what a themed session can do, where it's really deliberate practice, and what a session that's more diverse, more naturalistic, perhaps, where we're trying to not suppress the core elements of the game, but bring them out and focus on them, and the core is the stuff that really matters. Take away all the tinsel and focus on just the real crux of what you're trying to get at and what is required and what are the main features that make for good learning, and the main features within that you can coach that help for performance. Okay, so you could do that. So there's loads of different ways that we can do this. Okay, just to recap, we can chat about this insofar as you do just theme sessions. Okay, we might not, but again, I would say perhaps we shouldn't do that all the time. But you could do just theme sessions. You could do sessions where some of the exercises are themed, other exercises are focused more on the principles of coaching. Or else you could do, have a period where you are only doing, they really unthemed sessions, they really alive, dynamic, holistic sessions. You can move across that spectrum however way you like. But irrespective, actually, whenever you do decide to use themes, I would say is one universal rule would be just don't be bogged down by them. Okay, now let's just finish on why perhaps we do that. I see it sometimes as a symptom of comfortability for us as coaches. Okay, you'll if you haven't learned this already, I think as you move through coaching, certainly something that came across for me was I wanted order in a fairly chaotic landscape. Tidy sessions were controllable sessions. Theme sessions offer order, they offer tidiness. So theme sessions worked with me, they worked for me. But think what matters more here, your players' learning or your comfortability? And I think it's important as a coach to think about both those things together, of course. Because we need confidence, and comfort offers a sense that, and as we build competence, we need to feel confident. And all these things come together in the way that you'd have to plan sessions that you feel confident behind, that you feel comfortable delivering, and as you build competence, and as with that competence you build further confidence, I think you should challenge yourself to not be so comfortable, to be okay with just sitting back and sitting and existing within your session at the macro level and look at the macro coaching principles that you see, not the principles of the theme, the coaching principles of what make for an effective session. Okay, but again, do it developmentally. If right now you're just starting coaching and it just makes you feel confident, comfortable, and helps you maintain a sense of competence by having theme deliveries, then do that, okay? But just challenge yourself. Don't be married to that approach, okay? And allow yourself sometimes to focus on crafting sessions where, as I say, the macro level building blocks are still development are prioritised instead. Okay? So, but that's just my opinion. Listen to it or don't listen to it. Hopefully it makes you think. I think the best coaches, the best training programs, they want to get in as much as they possibly can. So I think, that's why I believe we need to make space for looser, more general sessions too. And don't see them as a sign of being amateur. See them actually as a sign of not, again, paying attention to what the niche coach is doing. but actually instead paying attention to what really matters, what's messy, but what's real. The game's messy, the game's real. And if we don't go completely radical with it, just bring a little bit of that into it. Just bring a little bit of unthemed work into it, of work where you'll go and touch on lots of points. Okay, bring a little bit of that into it in order to help more players in your session, in order to achieve meaningful learning more often in your sessions, and in order to achieve a synergy between the benefits that unthemed sessions bring when coupled with more structured themed sessions and the benefits that they also offer. Hopefully that's been useful, guys. Until next time, I'll see you then.